I don't believe I bear the right to such happiness, but if that time were to come, it would be upon my death, having devoted my life to forming a peaceful kingdom full of joyful citizens.
Within Fire Emblem Three Houses' original timeline, Dimitri was a character that was fundamentally driven by his contradictory desires to build people up and to punish the wicked. His entire character arc sent him down a dark path that caused him to reckon with the realities of life and death after the time skip. But in Three Hopes, Dimitri never underwent the trials that he faced in the original timeline, and dealt with his issues in a different way as a result. Dimitri's character in Three Hopes is defined as an individual who conceived of himself and his duties in a self-abnegating vacuum where he must undertake all burdens to protect others. Dimitri's dutifulness also extends to his kingship, where he feels a limiting obligation to all of his citizens that leaves him unwilling to enact rapid change that can harm people in the short term, making him a staunch advocate for slow and measured reform. Dimitri's arc in this game is thusly understanding the importance of his friends' involvement in their closure and duties, and a subsequent self-appreciation that he is never really able to fully reach.
Cringe.
It's another one.
The primary thematic departure for Three Hopes and its characters seems to be fundamentally tied to Shez's perspective of the three main lords. Much like at the beginning of Three Houses, Shez assesses Dimitri, Edelgard, and Claude, yet the games differ in Blaiddyd's pragmatic assessment of their positive and negative qualities, while Shez fixates only on their positive ones. In Dimitri's case, Shez doesn't recognize Dimitri's underlying darkness that Blaiddyd saw, instead choosing to focus on his compassion. This interaction contextualizes Dimitri's story as being more external in Three Hopes than in Three Houses proper, and establishes that Dimitri will likely never come to directly face the paradox that drives his soul in Three Houses. Instead, the reactionary strike by the Agarthans forces Dimitri to preemptively depose his uncle to limit the suffering of the kingdom. Although Dimitri hoped to see an amicable resolution with his uncle, he is forced to cast aside his personal feelings on the matter to fulfill his duty to his people and executes him. This sets up Dimitri's major character arc for Three Hopes, whereby he subordinates his will in favor of fulfilling his obligations to others. Moving forward into the time skip, Dimitri makes it clear that his major goals in the ensuing conflict are to dispense justice for the tragedy of Duscur, protect his people, and to slowly and responsibly reform Fodlan to create a brighter future. In this timeline, Dimitri understands the tragedy of Duscur far better than in Three Houses, and knows that the Agarthans were complicit in it. As such, he is able to pursue the truth and administer justice in a direct and righteous way to all the various individuals within the kingdom, Duscur, and the Empire who contributed to it. Dimitri remains stuck within a mindset where he believes that he is the only one who can shoulder those burdens of justice and protection, as seen in his sea support with Shez, where he secretly takes full responsibility for the recent war casualties and buries the dead alone. Dimitri even projects his obligations onto others, such as in his support with Ingrid, where Dimitri once again places too much of the blame for Ingrid's previous resentment onto himself, and his failure to help her even though she clarifies that it was her personal journey to go through. Dimitri's support with Ash reiterates the unnecessary responsibility, where he ultimately wishes for Ash to live for himself as a knight, instead of wasting his life throwing it away for some system of chivalry. Ash disagrees, saying that the knights like Glenn died for something that they believed in, making their sacrifices meaningful. Ash reasons that to live for himself, as Dimitri suggested, he must also be able to make the decision to lay down his life for something he loves and wishes to protect. Dimitri acknowledges the issue of this request and tries to continue working to make himself worthy of such a sacrifice. In the case of both Ingrid and Ash's supports, Dimitri takes responsibility for the feelings and motivations of others, believing that he ought to do more to help and protect them from negative mindsets or wasting their lives. But he too often fails to understand people's own journeys. It isn't until Dimitri is rescued from Ferdiad that he comes to realize the problem in thinking that obligations of justice and protection fall solely on him when the other Blue Lions come to save him from his imprisonment.
Dudu.
Take it, Your Majesty.
Whether it's duty towards the living, or the guilt for all those we have lost, such burdens are not yours to bear by yourself. We are here to fight by your side, Your Majesty, and so we shall, now and always.
Dudu outlines Dimitri's primary motivations and his duty to those living and his guilt for the dead, and encourages him to unbind himself from his crippling obligations because other people are there to support him. Now, a less self-destructive aspect of Dimitri is his goal to slowly reform and shape Fodlan to ensure a peaceful social transition that doesn't leave anyone behind or leave society vulnerable to chaos. He essentially says as much at the outset of the time skip, where he applauds a lot of Edelgard's reforms within Adrestia, but critiques the aggressive way that she is going about changing the world. Despite Dimitri's misgivings with the status quo and his desire to avoid war, Dimitri ends up offering sanctuary to the Church of Seros to avoid future bloodshed and chaos in a potential war of legitimacy. Dimitri's goal of slow but stable political reform can also be seen in his supports with Sylvain, Yuri, and Claude. In his supports with Sylvain, Dimitri goes to him for his genuine advice considering the future restructuring of the kingdom in relation to crests. They both come to the conclusion that the continual valuation of crests is necessary to deal with Shrang in the coming future, after which both of them admire their exceptional talents. While these two conversations are seemingly unrelated, they both reveal an appreciation of people's exceptional qualities and sees the value in appreciating people for whatever skills they may have, whether it be the possession of crests or personal talents. Then in his supports with Yuri catches Dimitri alone in an unsavory part of the kingdom and warns him that traveling by himself in these parts can ultimately put his life at risk, which can lead to the destabilization of the kingdom and suffering for its people. Dimitri acknowledges this problem and asks Yuri to accompany him throughout this area so that he might better understand the perspective of commoners using Yuri as a guide. In their final support, Dimitri discusses how his time within the slums has taught him that commoners need only representation within the government to make meaningful change toward political issues that affect them. After Yuri points out the necessity of social programs to create an informed and civically engaged population, Dimitri realizes how many components are required to truly reform the kingdom for the better. Finally, in his support with Claude, Dimitri deeply criticizes the blinders that Claude has for freeing people of the church, despite him sympathizing with Claude's goals. Dimitri states that destroying the church would cause chaos in Fargus among the clergy and its supporters, and would ultimately cause casualties and endanger Claude's life, leading to chaos in his new world. Dimitri finishes his critique, declaring,
If there are those who would be hurt by this, I consider it my duty to help them.
All of these situations show that while Dimitri wants to change Fodlan for the better, he also isn't willing to break any eggs to make that proverbial omelet, and believes in going about change in a procedurally just way. All of this leads to Dimitri's fundamental character flaw in Three Hopes, that being his duty-bound self-loathing and his subsequent inability to come to terms with his own worth. In his supports with Dudu, Dimitri is chastised by his loyal protector when he demands Dimitri stop working himself into exhaustion for his own safety. But Dimitri refuses, citing his duty. This interaction continues in their A support when Dudu finds Dimitri slumped over his desk with work. Dimitri was dreaming about a boy that demanded revenge for the tragedy of Dusker. Dimitri establishes that he's dedicated to fulfilling his duty, but has a reservation and asks Dudu what he would do if Dimitri made requests to avenge him, or if he would move on upon his death. Dudu declares that either way he would fight to avenge Dimitri, primarily for his own sake. Then Dudu asks if Dimitri can live for his own sake, to which Dimitri replies that he can't because his life belongs to his people and to the dead. In Azure Gleam, Dimitri has set all personal desires aside to serve others, appearing to be what profoundly separates Dimitri within Three Hopes from Dimitri within Three Houses. In Three Houses, Dimitri lost sight of his duties to his people and the dead in the face of his fixation on Edelgard, leading to his destruction in all routes except for his own. However, in Three Hopes, Dimitri always remains dedicated to leaving nobody behind and fulfilling his obligations regardless of his feelings. In this way, Dimitri never reaches the depths of depravity that he does in Three Houses, but he also never comes to terms with the destructive side and the paradoxical nature of his life. Dimitri is still afflicted with the same mental issues that tormented him in Three Houses, but he's able to simply internalize the voices into a profound self-hatred, as seen in his supports with Felix. In their B support, Dimitri asks if Felix hates him, due to Felix's scathing remarks about his attitudes and behaviors. Ultimately, Felix opens up, saying that he doesn't hate Dimitri, and clarifies that the tragedy is not his burden to bear alone. In their final support, Dimitri opens up to Felix about the voices of the dead that he hears, and how they always blame him for failing to save them. Felix understands the root of the problem to be Dimitri projecting his self-loathing and survivor's guilt onto the dead. Felix physically brings Dimitri to bed to stop his fixation on his failings and to help him move on. This fundamental theme of Dimitri sacrificing his own happiness and well-being comes to a head in his A support with Shez, where he declares that he needs to sacrifice himself for the sake of others because he won't let others be dragged in to suffer just as he has. Shez points out that there is one issue with that framework, that being that Dimitri never values himself enough and asks what makes him happy. Funnily enough, Rodrigue points out this same character flaw in his A support. Once again, Dimitri iterates that his happiness is dependent on serving his people well upon his own death. Dimitri only ever feels happy through serving others, and that seems to be his most essential characteristic within Three Hopes. Dimitri within Three Hopes seeks to create a world where no one has to endure the suffering that he puts himself through. At the start of the story, he decides to shoulder it all alone, but comes to learn how fulfilling it can be to allow others to help shoulder your burdens and empower you to become more. At the end of the game, Dimitri remains stalwart in his decision to uphold his duty to the living and the dead, and to create a better future for all. Even if he never conquers those demons within himself like in Three Houses, his friends will be there to protect him in his vulnerable moments. Hey, thank you so much for watching my video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed watching, and if you did, please be sure to let me know by giving me a like or leaving a comment with some of your thoughts on it. If you're new here, welcome, and please subscribe if you want to see more. Thanks again, and until next time.